As we train spiritually, we come to see the beauty, the wisdom in each living thing. We come to look, see, observe, know with compassion. And therefore believe in each living thing and in each person. Of course, this compassion, this belief, this love doesn't always feel justified by the behavior of living things, and in particular by the behavior of human beings. Therefore, we have the intent of providing some kind of cultivation, some kind of education to each and every human being, perhaps even each living thing. Typically, when we consider educating human beings, we think of providing some kind of information. This information may be coupled with a trade, with some kind of profession. In any case, we hope that by teaching each other how to do things, how to understand things, we will create a better world. And so education is maintained, is upheld throughout human societies. Some kind of education is given. Typically, in this education, there is some kind of ethical training, some kind of dispensation of morality. Now, this can be done in many different ways. Typically, it's carried with the culture of a given group, and then there may be courses, there may be conversations, there may be ceremonies in which a sense of what we should do, the right way to live, comes to be understood, comes to be explored. And this sort of education is very good. And that is to say, we teach people how things are, how they should be, what you should do in order to make the world a better place, in order to take care of yourself and others. This is a very good kind of education, and just to do this kind of education well is very difficult. It is not easy. Just this is difficult. Here, we also give this kind of education. This is a starting point. This is one of the starting points when people come here. What do we learn? Well, we learn how to get along. We learn how to live in this particular society. That means, naturally, learning how to run the community, how to keep everything going. And in doing that, we do all kinds of different tasks, from cleaning the floors to talking with supporters, everything. And for some of us, parts of that may not feel good enough for us. This is something that is very common. We feel like I'm not really doing anything. I'm just cleaning the floor. We don't want to learn all the different parts of a community's livelihood. But it's important that we ourselves come to know all of that. And we don't separate ourselves from something because we feel like someone else should do it instead. That we ourselves find the significance of achieving that particular skill. And we also come to learn other norms in terms of how we should live so that we take care of each other. We sometimes are concerned that there are so many rules here. We often forget that there are far more rules in the larger society. But we've just come to get used to them. I've worked with a number of refugees, for example, and it's interesting to work with people who have never been in this particular society. For example, let's say that you want to be able to heat your home. Let's say it's wintertime and you want to be able to not freeze to death, not have major problems come from being unable to, say, heat your home. Well, there are some significant rules that you have to follow in order to do that. You have to, for example, send a check to a company. Well, that's not so easy to send a check to a company. You might think it's very easy if you just grew up with that, but you have to find something called an envelope. It has to be an envelope with the correct address on it. The address has to be written in exactly the right place on the envelope, in the right order. There has to be a very specific item that is stuck onto the envelope. Also, you have to send the check. Now, the check is very hard to write. You have to write down the date on it. You have to write down the amount in 2 different ways. You have to learn a writing system in order to do that. You then have to sign it. You can't put those different items in the wrong places. Each of them has to go in a very specific place. And if you make any mistakes in any of that, well, then people will say that you have to now freeze to death. That's the punishment. You'll lose electricity, and your children's lives will be in danger. We often forget that there are rules like this in our society because we're used to them. Here, we actually observe the rules being made. We observe how and why it's done, and so it's much more apparent to us because we're not just being brainwashed. We're not just going along with things like most people. We're actually engaged in this process. Because we're engaged in this process, we see how important it is that the rules are made well. For example, in order to send that check at all, you need a bank account. To make a bank account, there are many more rules than the ones I just mentioned. And nobody knows why those rules are the way they are. They just are that way. But even people who work in banks don't know. I've asked often, and they always say, well, it's just how it is. It's like when I ask you here, why to do things this way. Well, traditionally, we've done it that way. So we're asked here to continually examine, why are we doing it this way? Therefore, we see it. Therefore, we're brought into an understanding. This is how we do it. This is why we do it. What's the significance of this? Leadership. Leadership. Well, that we are engaged in creating a new society, a new culture, a new future. Just this is very difficult. But here, we go beyond that. We take it to a completely new level, a level absolutely beyond merely learning information and being trained in a certain ethical code. We go even further by striving for awakening, striving for true spiritual insight. This is a kind of education that is not education. This is a matter of forgetting and shedding everything that we've learned, everything that we've gathered, everything that we've acquired. All of that set aside, we set aside mind and body and awaken. This insight frees us from suffering. It frees us from the mental slavery that results in mindless cooperation with systems of injustice. It allows us to see through the lies, the patterns that have held our minds in prison. Suddenly, everything becomes miraculous. Everything is shining. Everything is alive. The nonsensical feedback loops, sanskaras, that we have maintained that have caused us to behave in improper ways are broken. It's no longer that we are making ourselves, through effort, behave in ethical ways. It's that we directly see the significance of behaving in those ways and the consequences of not behaving in those ways. It's no longer the case that we hear about what other people said about the purpose of life, about the structure of perception, and are simply required to take that on faith. We can see directly for ourselves. And in doing that, we are liberated. Liberated from what? Liberated from existence, liberated from non-existence, liberated from helpless suffering, liberated from ignorance. This enlightenment, this awakening, this insight, is a completely different kind of education than the first. One could say that teaching people how things are is very difficult but important, but teaching people how things should be, this ethical code, is radically different. Well, it's somewhat different. It's not the same, but it's not different at the fundamental level. But this education, this training to awakening, to spiritual awakening, this is a completely different kind of, quote, education, to the point that we might call it non-education. It is not education. It's cleaning, purifying, forgetting everything we've learned, to see things as they are and to break through perception itself, to break through consciousness itself, to see in a way that isn't dependent on anything, not even perception or consciousness. This is a great achievement. If we can do this at all, we have succeeded at an incredible achievement. So, of course, the first, teaching people information, perhaps a skill, and also a code of conduct, an ethical standard, that alone is very difficult. It's difficult to do this well. To teach people awakening, this alone is very difficult. In the first case, we're learning to be leaders. We're learning how to change things, to make things better. The second case, we're learning how to be happy, learning how to achieve a kind of happiness that doesn't depend on making things better. In the first case, we're learning how to make other people do what we want them to do and make ourselves do what we want ourselves to do. The second case, we're learning how to stop doing all of that. The first case, we're learning how to engage in, you could say, conflicts over how we look at things, over how resources are allocated, over behaviors. Engage in those competitions and win. If you talk about education, you say, well, I want you to do well in school, so-and-so, so that you'll do well in your profession. You'll have money. But money is a limited resource. And so it's a matter of competition, as we know, once we enter the workforce. There is competition. The second case of awakening is a way of going beyond conflict, engaging in non-contention, without any competition, a kind of happiness that is not a limited resource in any way. In fact, is a kind of happiness that we find when we set aside all limited resources. And yet, there is a further stage. There is a further stage. That is, how can we, having gained both of these kinds of education, become leaders? How can we return to the first kind of education having achieved the second? Right now in the world, we don't know what's coming. We don't know what our civilization will be like in just a few decades, much less a few centuries. It's not even that long anymore. In the past, things changed very slowly, maybe over thousands of years. And then more recently, things have changed over hundreds of years. But right now, things are changing radically right within our own lifetimes, and we don't know what is going to happen. I have the sense that many people, probably most everyone listening to this talk, is simply unaware of the pace of change, of the amount of power that specific groups have over the history of the world, over what's going to happen. We're so caught up in our own little issues. Am I tired? Why did so-and-so say that? What do I think I should do about this? What's my view on this current political situation? We're unable to see that our future is, first of all, going to be radically different from our past. And second, that there is such a thing as having power over what happens. Some people have power over what is happening. No one has total power, but people are engaged in what's happening. It's our job to create a group of people here who can engage in those real situations, who can know what we should do, and who can win, who can actually effect change. This happens by getting over ourselves. And as we know who train here, this is not easy. It's not easy. We're so wrapped up in our own little issues. It's very hard for us to set that aside and open up to the possibility that we could actually have an impact on the future of the world. It's not easy to do that. It's not easy to even want to open up to the complexities of the world. And yet this kind of education is needed as well. If we consider what's happening right here in our little community, what's happening worldwide, as far as I can tell, the vast majority of it can be explained by people trying to avoid discomfort. People just trying to avoid discomfort. People feel uncomfortable and we don't want to. We feel uncomfortable and we don't want to. And so we'll do whatever it takes to avoid that discomfort. One of the main things we do in order to avoid discomfort is we maintain a delusional little bubble that we live in, shutting out the various things that make us uncomfortable. But it doesn't work. It doesn't work that way. We aren't successful at that. We then just live in a circumstance of constant insecurity, which is a deep form of discomfort because we know that we're living in a little bubble. To come to the point when we can break through that deep emotional discomfort, when we can move through that, and when we can see the larger world, this is essential to the kind of education we maintain here. Why? Because as the coming years pass, there's going to be a great deal of instability, insecurity, discomfort. And we need to be able to see through that discomfort in order to make the proper ethical decisions so that we take good care of our beautiful planet. Education that provides this must include, and we put it at the forefront, must include awakening. Because with awakening, we are clear that we're secure, that we're not ultimately, of course we go through discomfort, but we're not ultimately threatened by any kind of discomfort because we know how it ends. We know where it's going in the end. We know how it plays out. Because of that, we're able to move through all of that in a compassionate way. Because of that, we can be good leaders. Because we can be good leaders, we are in a position to create a culture, a new society that is of benefit to all living things. Simply because we've broken through our own delusions and moved forward from that awakening with compassion. Ultimately, though, even that isn't enough. So the first point about learning how things are, gaining information, maybe gaining a trade, learning how things should be, gaining an ethical code of conduct. This is very good, but here it's not enough. To go beyond that, to experience awakening, experience spiritual enlightenment, so that we know exactly how things are, we know exactly how we should behave directly, without just learning things from other people and memorizing it, but we ourselves directly understanding that and breaking through our constant fear of being uncomfortable, constant fear of death, constant fear of life, breaking through all of that so that we are capable of living truly. Even this isn't enough. Even this isn't sufficient here. So we go beyond that to becoming leaders, to becoming people who can guide the world. We take that basic knowledge, combine it with enlightened wisdom, and become leaders so that we can create a new and better society, so that we can be the people who create the story, who tell the story that guides our civilization, because the story that guides a civilization creates its future. That we are the ones, we are true leaders, and we should be because of our selfless, compassionate lifestyles. And yet here, even that isn't enough, because we have the further aim of exponential growth of that educational system. That means that people here are expected to become capable of creating new centers like this, so that we create these centers at an exponential rate of growth. And every few years, each center opens another center. This exponential growth is possible, and it's very powerful. It starts growing very quickly. And if we double the number of centers every 5 years, soon enough we have hundreds of centers. And those hundreds create thousands, thousands create millions. That will allow us to have an impact to change our civilization. What does that mean? Well, it means that people need to support that growth through providing resources and, for example, financial resources, and it means that the people who train here have to make a greater sacrifice, which is a sacrifice of their entire lives. Sacrifice of our views, sacrifice of our attachments, sacrifice of our assumptions, sacrifices of our acquisitions, and most importantly, sacrifices of our lives. Our whole life is given to the benefit of all life. This is our goal. And in doing that, we become authorities. We become capable of leading other centers like this one. As you see, the number of skills that are needed are very uncountably vast. One has to be able to engage in many different ways without losing track of an even clarity. This is what the training is for. And the people here, the people who come to train here, are the greatest treasure of the community, need to be cared for through others, seeing them as sacred, seeing them as beautiful, with compassion and appreciation, so that there's a sense that perhaps it is possible for me also to become such a leader and to create such a community and to change the world in my own way. Each of these communities will be autonomous and somewhat different, yet all of them will be linked in our commitment to serve the entire world. This moment in history is exactly the right moment for this. We don't know what's coming, but we know that things are changing. When things change, there's an enormous opportunity. It's our job to take advantage of this opportunity to be sure that we make use of the various developments over the coming decades for the benefit of life on Earth, rather than for the benefit of just a few human beings. This is our task. This is achieved through leadership. This is achieved through compassion. This is achieved through becoming capable of looking at every living thing, every human being, and seeing the beauty in them with eyes of love. To come to this point is the purpose, the significance of this training. We must not let up. We must continue to move forward until we are truly achieving exponential growth for the benefit of all living things. This is possible. We're doing it. We're on track. It requires constant hard work. I appreciate the hard work that you're putting in. Please let us celebrate our commitment, our compassionate commitment to all living things, and dedicate ourselves to bringing forth a culture of compassion, a culture of contemplation in this modern age. No, every one of us contributes to that. Every one of us has this ability. We dedicate ourselves to it, and we discover beyond our expectations that it is possible to achieve it.